Thanks to Thales and SCORAI for having me in. I'm very eager to learn how to improve my perspective on these issues, so I'm hoping that we'll have lots of constructive but deadly comments about all the defects in my paper and so forth. So let me give you the argument in brief, and then I'm going to go through it, and we'll have, I hope, at least a half an hour for the discussion. So the main argument here is that humanity has already overshot the global carrying capacity, and it's getting worse fast. And I'll show you some data, but there's much, much more. I really don't want to dwell on this aspect of it. And so how do we create a more sustainable world? It's going to require all of the technological innovation that we can muster and all the social and managerial innovation that we can muster as well to bring new inventions to scale and help the world's poor develop. But that's nowhere near sufficient. It's also necessary to address overconsumption by the affluent. And I want to be very clear. There are billions of people in the world today, and most of the population growth that's forecast for the next 50 plus years, the rest of the century, is projected to be in the poorest countries of the world. Those people need more than they have. And I want to be very clear about that up front. But for we the affluent, we the privileged, we already have, in my opinion, too much, and it's helping to destroy the carrying capacity of the planet. That is the foundation for all life, including ours. And so overconsumption and addressing this, what appears to be an inevitable quest for more among the already affluent, is a critical challenge that is going to be the focus of today. I've written previously on the innovation challenge, the scale-up challenge, but that's not the focus for today. Now, how is that going to happen? Well, we can't expect private firms, for-profit firms, or maybe even for-benefit firms to lead on this issue, because reducing consumption is just diametrically opposed to their business model. And so they will oppose overtly and in other ways any policies or actions that are aimed at voluntary reduction in consumption. I don't believe we can expect governments to lead on this issue, because they are committed to and have made a fetish out of economic growth for all kinds of reasons, ideological as well as pragmatic reasons, such as the largest economies are going to be best able to put military resources into the field, will dominate the soft power channels that are available as well. So I don't think we can expect governments to lead on that issue. So what does that leave? It leaves the public. It leaves a grassroots social movement. I don't think this is something that will happen just because lots of individuals choose to reduce their consumption. It's going to require organizing, but we don't really know how to do that. At least I don't know. There's been many successful examples of social movements for change, and I think that's a hopeful sign, because as I wrote in the paper, anything that exists is possible. But with respect to these issues, I at least don't know how a grassroots, broad-scale social movement for sustainability and a voluntary shift to a low-consumption life for the already affluent can be created and sustained. So that's the argument in brief, and I'm hoping that you're going to help answer this last question and help me improve our theory here. So a little quick background. I think this will be largely very familiar territory for most of you, but I think it's essential context. So of course, when people talk about, well, we have energy shortages and we have a climate problem, we have water problems and resource conflict and so forth, this takes up a lot of the air and energy around debates in the sustainability space. But those issues are not the problem. They are symptoms of the problem. The underlying driver is growth on a finite planet. So here's the last 2,000 years of population, human population, 3 billion in 59, 6 billion in 99, projected by the UN medium fertility variant projection to be 9.3 billion in 2050 and over 10 billion by 2100. And of course today it's 7.2 billion, and it's rising at about 77 million, 75 million people a year. That's almost adding an Egypt or a Germany every year. Not quite. But population growth is only a piece of the puzzle, and I'm really not interested in having this debate about is it population or is it economic growth. It's both. And there are people out there who say, no, it's not population, it's economic growth, and there's other folks who say, no, it's population. It's both. Here's the other side of it. This is the last 2,000 years of real economic output. Of course, a lot of these estimates are uncertain as you go back farther. But there's no question the world economy, the world's real economic output, has been growing exponentially, hyper-exponentially, in fact. And like any exponential growth process that goes on long enough, it looks like nothing is happening for a long, long time. But the last few doublings, it just seems to explode. Here's a close-up of the last 60 or so years. And on average, the world's real output, so gross world product in real terms, has been growing at about 3.5% per year. So how long does it take for something that grows at 3.5% to double? Now, I'm going to exercise my privilege as a professor in the School of Management to cold call the audience here. So I didn't remember your name.
Daniel.
Daniel. So if something grows at 3.5% per year, how long does it take to double? 20 years is exactly right. It's the rule of 70. It's very simple. 20 years is exactly right. Now, if something doubles every 20 years, how much bigger would the world economy be if that growth rate persists over the next century? So, no calculators permitted. Anybody? 32. Rich, yeah, that's that physics background. That's great. So that would mean if the world economy continues to grow at that rate, and it's actually, notwithstanding the Great Recession, been growing somewhat faster than that in the last few years, then in 100 years, the real production of goods and services around the world would be 32 times larger than it is today. I don't believe that's possible. And to give you one example, let's talk about mobility. So in the developing world, you have billions of people who get around right now like this, and every single one of them wants a private automobile. And in China, where a lot of them are getting private cars, here's what's happening. This is about 20 lanes of traffic. And you might know that a couple of years ago, there was a 9-day-long traffic jam in China on this road. And it's just not going to happen. So here's an example. If everybody in the world in the year 2050 lived and drove the way Americans do today, what would it be like? Well, so there'd be 9.3 billion people according to the UN, but they would be driving nearly 8 billion light-duty vehicles. This doesn't count trucks, just passenger vehicles, light-duty vehicles. Those cars, using the way Americans drive today, would be consuming 382 million barrels of oil per day, and that's more than 5 times total world oil production for all uses. And they'd be generating 60 gigatons of CO2 per year, which is basically double the total greenhouse gas CO2 emissions today from all sources of fossil fuels, not just from oil. And those vehicles would take up 143,000 square kilometers, which is an area the size of Bangladesh, just in parking spaces. Forecasting is difficult, especially about the future, but that's not going to happen, and I'll bet every dollar I've got on it. Collecting in the year 2114, that might be tricky, but that's not going to happen. So we have this collision between growth and the finite carrying capacity of our planet. And to make it slightly more formal, there are 3 necessary conditions to have a sustainable world. And I stress these are necessary conditions. They're not sufficient. We also are going to need equity and political stability, and all kinds of other conditions are going to have to be met to create a sustainable world. But these are the fundamental conditions that are absolutely necessary, and they're all grounded in basic physics, specifically mass balance. If you divide the carrying capacity of the world into 3 basic categories, you have your renewable resources, you have wastes, and you have non-renewable resources. And if we start with renewables, the fundamental condition for sustainability is that you cannot draw down, harvest your renewables faster than they regenerate. This is a fundamental consequence of mass balance. There is no debate about this. It's not a question of what political ideology or political party you belong to. This is simply basic physics. So if you Cut down your forest faster than new biomass grows, the stock of trees will fall until you can't harvest anymore. If you catch the fish faster than there's recruitment or regeneration, the stock of fish falls until there's no more fish to catch, etc. Same for any renewable, freshwater, renewable energy, et cetera, et cetera. And it's the same with wastes. In a sustainable society, you cannot generate wastes faster than they are either recycled or decay or otherwise rendered harmless. For example, you can't dump sewage into your river faster than bacteria process it into harmless water, carbon dioxide. And if you do, your river is going to go anaerobic and you get what's known as the big stink. You can't put carbon dioxide in the atmosphere faster than it's removed over the long haul, et cetera. And on non-renewables, there's no inflow by definition because non-renewables are non-renewable. So in the long run, the sustainable condition is there cannot be any extraction of non-renewables at all in a sustainable society. We are nowhere close to meeting any of these three fundamental criteria for a sustainable society. We are harvesting our renewables and degrading them faster than they regenerate across the board in basically every category of renewables. We're generating wastes of all kind, not just CO2, but toxics that accumulate in the environment, groundwater pollution, et cetera, far faster than they can be broken down into harmless substances. And of course, we're overwhelmingly dependent on non-renewable resources, especially the fossil fuels. When you add all this up and do the empirical work that others have done, what you find is we are in a condition of overshoot. So this is, of course, Mathis Wackernagel's ecological footprint, but there are many other studies, the planetary boundary studies, Steve Running's work, many others. They all show the same basic conclusion. And here what you see is that in around 1970, the total global ecological footprint of humanity exceeded the available biocapacity of the Earth and has continued to grow to the point where we now need 1.5 Earths. We consume 1.5 Earths worth of biocapacity, of carrying capacity, resources, waste generation, et cetera, every year. And of course, we only have the one Earth. Now, some of my students ask, well, how is that possible? And the answer is very simple. Just as you can live above your income temporarily by accumulating debt and selling your assets, we are doing the same thing here by accumulating debts to nature that will eventually be paid and selling off, drawing down, destroying, despoiling our natural capital, exactly because we're out of balance because of all of these. But that can't go on forever, and most studies suggest that by the end of this century, the reckoning will be upon us, at least. So sometime between now and the end of the century, and of course, everything is uncertain. But this is not an issue for the next 1,000 years. This is an issue for our lives, the lives of our children, and the lives of our grandchildren. And of course, the footprint is extraordinarily inequitably distributed around the world. So the big red bloated areas are the regions of the world that are in ecological deficit, meaning their footprint is far higher than the biocapacity of their region. And you can see that it's the developed world primarily, with China coming up very quickly, India coming up very quickly, large populations, rapidly growing economies. And there's really not very many places left in the world that are in ecological surplus. And this inequity, of course, parallels the income and wealth inequity in the world. So, if we're going to create a more sustainable world, we're going to need a huge amount of new technologies. We're going to need invention. This is what happens, I hope, across the river at the science and engineering labs at MIT and, of course, at many other institutions. Our smart, talented folks are out there creating new technologies and new opportunities. These are going to be advances in basic science and engineering, new technologies for energy to promote sustainable development around the world, to bring health and education and all the other opportunities that the poor of the world are legitimately entitled to, and to do that in a way that doesn't destroy the carrying capacity of our world. We're also going to need to mitigate the environmental harms that are already out there and getting worse, and to adapt to the unavoidable changes that are already in place, the climate change that's already happening and baked into the pipeline. But that's not enough. Just having a great new technology isn't enough. This is not news to anybody in the room. We also require implementation. We've got to get it done. We've got to bring it to scale. This is where my part of MIT comes into play, and the economics department, and our social science folks, people like Larry and Nick, and other folks who are concerned with, great, you've got a terrific new technology. How do you get it out there? How do you get deployment, adoption, diffusion, bring it to scale, bring the costs down? That was an issue of entrepreneurship and commercialization, new enterprises and incumbent large enterprises. It's about organizational learning and change, especially for the large incumbents. And it's also about getting public policies in place that are aligned with accomplishing this, like a carbon tax and other policies that will overcome the many market failures that are out there, not just the market failures that are obvious, like we don't price the negative environmental externalities of pollution, et cetera, but also market failures like we don't have sufficient coordination across the different stakeholders in complex systems that are required in order to come up with good solutions. So just coming back to the transportation analogy, in order to get alternative fuel vehicles on the road, so let's just focus on cars. I think the transportation solution is going to require, of course, changes in settlement patterns, new modes, more public transit, more bike sharing, more car sharing, and new institutions like Lyft and Uber and so forth. But people are still going to want individual private vehicles, and we're going to need alternative fuels for those vehicles. You cannot expect the market to simply make that happen because, for example, nobody is going to buy, let's say, an electric car or a biofuel-powered car or a hydrogen fuel cell-powered car unless they're sure that they can get juice for it, fuel for it, more or less anytime and anywhere. But nobody is going to invest the hundreds of billions of dollars to create ubiquitous fueling infrastructure unless they're sure there's going to be a market for that. That's a market failure. It's a reinforcing feedback loop that creates a market failure. That's a different kind of impediment to implementation and scale up than we don't price carbon appropriately. And all of those kinds of market failures are going to have to be addressed. Now, that's hard. And I've written extensively in the past about what some of the impediments are to that, some of the success stories that are out there, and some of the systems principles that can help us do these things. But I don't want to focus on that today because it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. So why? So this is a complex diagram, but and I've written on this in great detail previously, as have many other authors. But let me go through it pretty quickly to make the case for why overconsumption is really the key leverage point here. So over here, what we have are the growth engines. We have population and the productive capacity of our economy. And so population grows by positive or reinforcing feedback. It's obvious how, right? Bigger the population, the more babies. If that exceeds the death rate, the population grows, and so on and so forth. That's indicated here by reinforcing loop 1. And it's the same process for the growth of the economy. The more productive capacity we have, plant equipment, knowledge, human resources, et cetera, market institutions, then the more real output we produce. We consume a lot of that, but the larger the real output, the more is available for investment. Investment grows productive capacity, another positive feedback. The result is that exponential growth that I just showed you a little while ago. Much faster historically for the economy than for population. However, that growth cannot go on forever in the context of a finite world. Here's the global carrying capacity. So that aggregates all of the three categories that we just discussed, the renewables, the wastes, and the non-renewables. And there's a consumption and degradation rate for that carrying capacity and a regeneration and restoration rate, right? So we can reforest, we can recharge our aquifers, we can have recruitment of fish stocks, but we also catch them, cut down the trees, poison our waters. Now, when human activity gets large relative to global carrying capacity, that lowers the rate of growth in population and the economy and could eventually cause those growth rates to become negative. If you just look at this side and assume that the carrying capacity is exogenous, it's just out there, that's Malthus. That's what Malthus said. But of course, it's much more intricate than that. The carrying capacity is dynamic. There's consumption and degradation and regeneration and restoration. And the feedbacks here talk about how that works and interacts with the growth process. So the first thing is, of course, the higher the human activity, the faster and larger the consumption and degradation of the carrying capacity are. That's just basic physics. The more people there are, the more they eat, the more water they use, the more waste they generate, etc. But technological innovation can affect how much impact each person or each dollar of real output has on that resource base, on the carrying capacity. And so as technology improves, with a delay, that scale-up diffusion process, the footprint of each individual or each dollar of economic output can go down. Now, what stimulates the growth of technology? Well, when resources become scarce in any particular domain, like energy or water or fish or whatever it might be, prices should rise where markets function. Social concern should rise. That might stimulate government policy to try to adapt or mitigate or come up with substitutes. That leads to innovation, which improves the state of technology, which then lowers the consumption. You have a negative link on this link here. So as technology improves, consumption per person or per dollar of GDP falls. And that creates a balancing feedback loop right here called the technological solution feedback, which is the focus of most discussion in the sustainability domain. How do we get alternative energy out there? How do we promote efficiency? How do we get people to recycle, et cetera? Now, two things about this are critical. The first is there are time delays in that feedback loop. Scarcity does not immediately manifest. After it does, prices don't immediately rise. They do where markets are relatively unfettered, but in many parts of the world, the price of fuel, the price of bread is fixed by the government, and it just doesn't go up when scarcity rises until the government runs out of hard currency to subsidize the difference. And then it tends to jump, and then you get a riot, and then there's a new government which lowers the price back down again. So, you know, markets are imperfect, and governments react slowly, and policy takes a long time to form. So there's a major delay between the emergence of scarcity and the response. Then there's a delay between the response, higher prices, increased R&D budgets for alternative energy, and the actual creation of those new technologies. Then there's a very long delay for the diffusion and scale-up process and the turnover of the existing inefficient, inappropriate capital. And so there's huge delays in this loop. In addition, technology isn't always helpful. There are many technologies that might help with one particular problem, but they create new problems. So you pick your favorite one, whether it's nuclear power that provides carbon-free or roughly carbon-free energy if you don't count the life cycle costs of the cement, et cetera, but creates a waste disposal and a proliferation hazard. And you could go through the same analysis for any. Antibiotics are saving millions of lives, but they create resistant pathogens. Same with herbicides like glyphosate, Roundup, et cetera. So that creates this feedback here that I call the technological nightmare loop. And it's a reinforcing or vicious cycle feedback because it says we have scarcity, you get some reaction, you get a new technology that in the short run mitigates the problem, but over the long run, with an additional delay, the technological side effects manifest. You see, it took 15, 20 years for the harmful effects of DDT to manifest, get noticed, and so forth. And that degrades the carrying capacity. And then as scarcity becomes worse, the temptation is, well, we need another technological solution. Now down here, you have the ecological dynamics around the carrying capacity, specifically regeneration. So, you take a little bit, you take a few of the fish, there's more room in their carrying capacity for the fish. They're going to respond, they're going to grow back. You take a few trees in a forest, creates sunlight, more resources, you get more growth. But here, this reinforcing loop called the environmental tipping point loop is the idea that, yeah, you take a few fish, they're going to reproduce and restore their stocks, but you take all the fish or most of the fish and the stocks will collapse. And the same with the forest, the same with fresh water. You drain an aquifer too far, brackish seawater will intrude. Now the entire aquifer is ruined. So that's another very dangerous loop, and we know that there are lots of such reinforcing loops out there. Now, that was really fast, and normally that's a whole 2-hour kind of presentation. But here's the question. What happens is this entire system integrating the economy, demographics, technology, the ecological dynamics of the planet interacts and generates behavior? Well, right now, growth is the dominant dynamic. These reinforcing loops are very powerful, but we're already in condition of overshoot. Now, will technology save the day? If technology is too slow, market failures prevent this reaction, so this loop is broken. Or if there's lots of unintended harms from technological innovation. And if the carrying capacity is not resilient and the tipping points are close, then we're screwed. We're gonna go over the tipping point and the carrying capacity collapses, and as it collapses, both population and economic output will collapse, and we're looking at a holocaust of unprecedented dimensions. So that seems clear. But what everybody believes is if the opposite is true, so the delays are short, the side effects are mild or none, the carrying capacity is robust and resilient, the tipping points are far away, problem solved. And my argument is no, that's dead wrong. So do the following mental simulation. Suppose some aspect of the carrying capacity begins to limit the growth of our economy. But assume that this process here of innovation is very fast and very low cost and has no unintended harms. What happens? Well, we're going to solve that particular resource problem. So then what happens? There's no involuntary constraint on growth, and so population, and especially the economy, will continue to grow until you hit some new constraint, or the old one is a binding constraint again. Solve that problem, and you'll enable more growth until you hit the next one, and the next one, and the next one, until at some point, because it's a finite world, you can't solve the problem, or you can't solve it in time, or the costs of doing so are prohibitive and stop growth. So it's not enough to have innovation. It's absolutely necessary because we've already overshot, but it's not enough. As long as there's growth as the driver on this side, population and especially economic growth, there's no technological solution for the challenge of creating a sustainable world, because any headroom that you create through innovation will be quickly used up by more growth. So this is the part that really gets my students very anxious, because at MIT, we believe in the power of innovation and technology, and we should, and it's great. I love that stuff. But the idea that there isn't a technological solution for every problem is something that really doesn't sit well with a lot of people, and it's not just my friends across the river, it's a broad view in society. We want to believe that there's this savior, that there's this deus ex machina that's going to come along, and we can keep living the way we're living with no changes, and all problems will be solved. It's just not true. So if we're going to create a sustainable society, we have to strengthen this feedback, which says we're going to voluntarily consume less. Population growth would have to stop, and economic growth would have to stop. Otherwise, we just bump into one limit or another until we fail to solve the problem and collapse. So on the population side, this is the UN projections, the most recent UN projections. And the median fertility variant is here. And this is the high fertility and low fertility variant. And this gets you to that 9.3, 10.1 by 2100. And it's very optimistic, in my opinion, because this line with the open circles is what they call the instant replacement scenario. So that's if you could magically snap your fingers, and from this moment on, every person on average only replaces themselves. And you'll see that the actual forecast is just basically the same, which means that the UN is assuming that the demographic transition is going to proceed very, very quickly, especially in the developing world where births are much larger than deaths right now. And I think this is all fairly familiar. And I'm willing to stipulate for our discussion that the demographic transition, which you see here for Sweden, will in fact continue. I believe the UN's assumption here is optimistic, because the demographic transition requires and is driven by, under most people's theory of why this happens, it requires development, it requires economic growth, it requires a transition from an agrarian, labor-intensive society to an industrial and post-industrial society. And it's not obvious, but let's assume, let's stipulate that the population problem will solve itself. There's long delays in that, and if you look at Egypt, for example, Deaths fell very, very quickly. Births are falling at about the same pace that they fell in the industrialized world. But there's that huge gap there, which means the population is growing very, very, very quickly. But let's stipulate for today's discussion that the demographic transition will continue around the world as the UN suggests, and that population will stabilize at the medium fertility level, 9.3 in 2050, a little over 10 billion in 2100. The real challenge is economic growth. And so here, I think, is the big puzzle. And so I, for many years, have asked my students in my system dynamics classes, my sustainability classes, to tell me how much money is enough for them. And over the years, I've learned I have to ask it in a way that's very specific and closes all the loopholes that they come up with to explain the large numbers they give me. So you can read this in the paper, but basically I say, how much money would you need to spend every year, spend, not earn, to be happy? That is, how much would be enough? And then I've got to close all the loopholes. So imagine that I can guarantee, I'm the king of the world, and I can guarantee that you get an annuity for the entire rest of your life. It's automatically adjusted for inflation, so you don't have to save anything for defense against asset erosion from inflation. It's, you don't have to save anything for retirement because you get this as long as you live. It's after all taxes, so you don't have to worry about that. And everybody else in the world gets their number, whatever it is, and their annuity, so there's no motivation for you to accumulate a bequest and leave something for your heirs or accumulate for charity, because everybody in the world gets theirs, right? So just how much money? So, and they can put a number, or they can put a number that says at least this much, but more is always better. So what are the results? Well, I've done this for many, many years. Here's typical results from my system dynamics class, which is a broad swath of the MIT, Sloan, MBA, and other departments and Harvard student population, 112 people. And here's the numbers. So the average is 300,000 per year, and the maximum was 4 million. I've seen 10, 15, 100 million per year. And no, seriously, I'll tell you a very quick story, and then I'm going to move on very fast. I used to be on the board of a nonprofit, and one of the patrons of this nonprofit is a very, very wealthy person. And I had breakfast with her one day, and I was explaining this. And I said, yeah, I get these really, really ridiculous numbers, like 10 million a year. And she looked at me, and she said, yeah, you know, I've found it's really hard to spend more than 10 million a year. And she was not being ironic. So, you know, this is very scary. And you know, almost 2/3 of them said at least this much per year to spend, but more is always better. And here you can see how that amount of spending compares to average income per capita in different parts of the world. And the ratios are crazy. So, so this is really quite troubling. And then, you know, I've asked the following kinds of questions for my students. I didn't invent these questions, but they're really useful. So, you have to choose between these two worlds. Last year, you earned $150,000. This year, you earned $200,000. Or, in World 2, last year you earned $200K. This year, you only earned $150. And I'm trying to close the loopholes here. The prices of all goods and services are the same in both worlds, and the environmental impact of both worlds is equal and negligible. So which world do you want? So what do my students say? Well, the vast, vast majority typically say they want to have World 1. And that's the wrong answer from a financial point of view, right? The net present value of World 2 is higher than World 1. You should strictly prefer the money up front. Now, why don't they choose that? Well, what they say is, I want my salary to go up every year. Or some of them say, you know, if I had the extra money up front, I would spend it, and then I'd have to cut my standard of living. There's nothing in the question that says you have to spend the extra $200. So they don't believe they have any self-control. And here's a quote. An increase, this is a direct quote, an increase in salary represents the increase of my value and contributions to the world. This is the kind of comment, and there are many comments like this because they fill in on the online questionnaire why they've chosen the world they've chosen, that I find most troubling. It's not just, you know, I feel like, you know, every year I should earn more. It's that I conflate a higher income every year with my worth as a human being. But this is what they say. Now this one is troubling, but it goes to the bias for growth. And this one I find even worse. So now you have to choose again between two worlds. You earn 150,000 per year in World 1, but everybody else earns half, 75,000. Or in World 2, you earn 250,000 per year, but everybody else earns twice as much, 500K per year. And again, the same conditions apply. Goods and services the prices are the same and the environmental impact is the same and negligible. Now, which world do you prefer? There is no sort of financially correct right answer here. It's strictly a values question. And here's typical responses. By more than 2 to 1 in this sample, this is a large sample, what they tell me is I'd be willing to give up $100,000 per year of income as long as I can earn twice as much as everybody else. And the reason this is so troubling is, of course, that's impossible. Everybody cannot be richer than everybody else. And why do they say this? Why are they willing to give up? Now, some substantial chunk sort of, quote, get it right and say, no, I'd rather have more, and I don't care about everybody else. But that's a very small minority here. What they typically say is having more buying power than others is nice. Or humans are all about relative position. Being honest, World 1 just sounds more appealing. What they really say is, look, I would feel poorly. I would feel bad if other people had more than me. And of course, this creates an unwinnable rat race. So now a little bit of data, and then we'll get to the central conundrum. So the dominant theory, of course, is the core theory of economics, which is that your utility goes up in your consumption. Here, I've got real GDP per capita in the United States. That's income, but people consume most of their income, so consumption is highly correlated with this. And since 1970, so over the past 40 plus years, real income and real consumption in the United States has more than doubled. And that should make us happier. That should improve our utility. But the data are that that's just not true. So the survey data here come from the General Social Survey, where they've been asking this question: how happy do you think you are? Are you, extremely happy, very happy, somewhat happy, not so happy, miserable, etc. And it's always asked in the same way. I don't want to go into methodology. And at the very least, it's not going up. And I think you could argue it's trending downward. And this is the same all around the world. For example, Dick Easterlin has a recent paper, it was in the Proceedings of the National Academy, where he basically measured subjective well-being or life satisfaction, aka happiness, in China. Since 1990, income per capita on average in China has quadrupled. And hundreds of millions of people have been lifted out of grinding poverty into a developing middle class. Happiness is down on average, and it's especially down if you're in the bottom third or even the middle third of the income distribution. Only the elites have any increase, and it's not statistically significant. So, and when you look at this cross-sectionally, it's exactly the same story. So here's income per capita, and then subjective well-being on the vertical axis, and you can see that if you're poor, if you don't have access to enough food, to a warm, safe, dry place to live, to any kind of mobility, any access to electricity or education or healthcare, you're pretty miserable. And as your income goes up, your happiness on average rises very sharply. I think this is all familiar to everybody here. But then it saturates, and you have many countries with very high income but are no happier than countries that have much, much lower income per capita. And the question is, why is this happening? So I think the feedback view on this is very useful. So let's start with a basic feedback map of why this is happening. So I think this is the core economic theory that's still the dominant ideology. It says your happiness, your utility, your subjective well-being is a function of the gap between the consumption you want, driven by your basic needs, and the consumption you actually have. So if I can't consume, don't have the food, shelter, education, healthcare, et cetera, that I need to fulfill my basic needs, I'm going to be unhappy. The bigger the shortfall, the lower your happiness. The solution for that is enterprise and hard work, ratio algebra. So if I'm less happy, I'm going to have to work harder. If I work harder, my income goes up. Well, let's just trace it out, okay? So if my desired consumption were to go up, I'm going to have a bigger shortfall between my goal and my actual consumption. That's going to make me miserable. The solution is enterprise, so I work hard. If I do, my income rises, my consumption will rise, and that closes the gap. So the core balancing feedback loop that is at the heart of the ideology of basic economics. But although that loop is real, especially for people whose consumption is below basic needs, it's not the only thing going on. And of course, you know, that should improve my happiness. For the affluent, there's other feedback loops that are far more important. So in particular, your desired consumption level rises as your actual consumption rises. This is the idea of habituation. I don't want to go into the evidence. It's extensive at every level, from the neurological level, long-term potentiation, to aggregate macroeconomic data. So what does this mean? If my desired consumption goes up, the shortfall increases, I'm less happy, I work harder to close the gap, my income goes up, my consumption goes up. It does indeed close the gap, that's what we just discussed, but after a year or so, I get used to whatever level of consumption I want, and that means in order to be happy, I've got to have something new, something more, and that's why I call this feedback loop. It's a reinforcing loop, or it's going to operate as a vicious cycle. It's known in psychology as the hedonic treadmill. I call it the thrill is gone, after B.B. King, because I got to have more. And that means the shortfall goes up, and now I'm even more miserable, despite the fact that I can fly first class instead of coach. I have a bigger house than I used to have. I have a nicer car. I'm no happier, because all that consumption, I just got used to it, and it didn't fill the existential hole in my soul. But that's just the beginning of the story, because my desired consumption is also powerfully determined by what I believe others have. And that's what I just showed you with World 1 versus World 2. The evidence for this is also extremely compelling. I won't go into it much. And that's greatly amplified by advertising and the media. So this creates more reinforcing feedbacks. If consumption goals go up, I have a bigger shortfall, I'm less happy, I work harder, and that raises my consumption, and that should work, except that it also, when everybody is doing this, raises the consumption of everybody else, which then is amplified by the media and advertising, and then my desired consumption goes up even more. So this one is, of course, the relative position, or keeping up with the Joneses loop. And this one is what I call lifestyles of the rich and famous. And the data for this are very, very clear, so I won't spend any time on this. But if you're in the upper quartile of income anywhere in the world, and I just showed you China, you're happier than if you're in the lower quartile, even independent of your absolute income. So the people who are in the bottom quartile of the US or Britain today are immeasurably wealthier than folks in other parts of the world who are more happy, because they're in the bottom of their social network. You know, here's the core data. I do count my blessings, but then I end up counting those of others who have more and better blessings, and that pisses me off. And the amplification by the media is really powerful. So Bruno Frey and his colleagues did a study of television watching in Europe, and what they find, in brief, you can read the data here, is the more TV you watch, and this is Europeans, this is not just, you know, bubble-headed Americans, the less happy you are. Now, there's a clear feedback or endogeneity problem. Maybe you're watching more TV because you're unhappy. That's part of the feedback loop that I'm describing, so let's not get hung up on econometric details here. But the effect size is huge. If you watch more than 2.5 hours of TV a day in Europe, it lowers your subjective well-being 40% as much as if your spouse dies. This is a big effect. And those folks have fewer social activities, weaker networks, they're less satisfied with their financial position, they feel less safe, and they have less trust in people. And why is this? Well, what do you see on TV? You see people who are thinner, younger, more beautiful, have more stuff than you all the time. And of course that's going to make you, and you see murders and crime, and you know, of course that's going to happen. Now, advertising, I think, is very powerful here, and I just want to give you an example. So there's a magazine in the United States called Lucky Magazine, and I don't know how many of you have ever seen it. Have you seen it? No? Okay, good. So they had an ad campaign. It's aimed at women. It's like Vogue or, you know, any of those magazines, but with more ads. And they had a house ad campaign, and it starts like this. It says, "My kids call the nanny mom." And I read this and I thought, oh gosh, that is a horrible problem, right? You're so busy, you're so self-involved, you don't have any time for your children, they don't even think of you as their mother, and they're more attached to your nanny. And then they say, well, you need to fill the void. And I think, great, you know, this is a big existential hole in your soul. You better change your life. But what is their solution? Their solution to fill this void is to go out and buy a $1,000 pair of shoes. So, and this is, of course, what corporations want you to do, is substitute material goods and consumption for the things that are actually important in making you happy. I showed this ad to the Dalai Lama a couple years ago in a presentation at MIT where he was with us, and I think he was pretty shocked. So we're still just scratching the surface of all these feedback loops. So here's another one I think is very important. The more time we spend working in order to drive this, which doesn't work because of these feedbacks, the less non-work personal time, I don't want to call it leisure, but all the time that you're not working, you've got. And so how do you compensate for the time famine? What you do is you have to substitute consumption and paid services for what you would have done yourself. So have a nanny. And I'm not against nannies. You know, my wife and I put our children into daycare. It was cooperative daycare, and we spent time there. But still, you know, they were in daycare. I'm not opposed to that. You eat dinner out instead of cooking your own food. You outsource your cleaning, and home maintenance and repair and sewing and all that stuff. And that all costs money. So the more you work, the less time you have, the more you've got to have time-saving services and goods, which means I have to have more income in order to pay the bills. And that's another vicious cycle. And now you can begin to see how this drags people into a trap. In the background paper, I discussed what I call the capability trap for businesses, where if you underinvest in maintenance and learning and training, your performance degrades, and now you don't have the resources for maintenance and learning and training and investment in capabilities, and so your capabilities degrade even more, and pretty soon your business is in trouble, or your city like Los Angeles, where infrastructure is crumbling and the average Angelino is spending almost $900 a year to repair the damage to their car from the lousy roads, and yet they're unwilling to pay $30 more per year in a sales tax to provide the funding to fix it. But this is still really above the waterline, and below the waterline, the rest of the iceberg, I think, is where the real important action lives. So as we have less time, we don't have time for exercise, to eat healthily, for personal development, for whatever spiritual practice, secular or religious, that we might want to engage in. And as that declines, our physical and mental health degrades, and we become less happy. But it's hard to know, because there's long delays here, that this is the problem. And so it's very tempting for people to say, well, if I just had more money and I could have more stuff, then I would be okay, I'd be happier. And that's not true, of course. So here's another vicious cycle. But it's not just exercise and, you know, keeping your mind and body and your spirit healthy and happy. It's also that you don't have time now for any relationships. You don't have time for friends, for family, for your community, and that means your physical and mental health will degrade. There's plenty of data out there to suggest that when you're out there engaged in deep, meaningful relationships with other folks, it's not only good for the world, it's good for you. And then, of course, you don't have any time to be of service, to the people in your community who aren't your immediate family, and to make a contribution. And that, of course, degrades your physical and mental health as well. There's lots of data that shows if you help other people, you are happier. If you give money to other people, you're happier than if you spend that money on yourself. Elizabeth Dunn, for example, has done a lot of work on this. It's quite a robust result. So now what have you got here? What you've got is a capability trap at the personal level, where you underinvest in these kinds of activities and the capabilities that go with them that enable you to be effective here. You become less happy. You try to compensate by earning and spending, but none of that works for all of these reasons, so you have to do even more. You become addicted to spending. And what's the result? Well, you know, see? Isn't this better than being happy? Now, of course, a lot of people don't like this, because what they say is, well, you know, researchers say I'm not happier for being richer, but do you know how much researchers make? Okay, so I want to try to wrap it up and have discussion. I think it's obvious that corporations are not going to lead on this because reducing consumption is exactly opposite to their business model. In the paper, I give the example of Walmart. Let me skip that and take a more interesting and provocative example, which is Patagonia. So, you know, Walmart, big, horrible corporation. I think it's not quite true. There's a lot of good things happening in that organization. Anything that big is not all good and all bad. But it's clear that their business model is eco-efficiency is wonderful, because if we can take waste out of our processes and our supply chain, that lowers our costs. That's exactly perfectly aligned with our business model. And then our prices can go down and we gain even more market power. And that's perfect for our business model. But are they ever going to be willing to adopt policies that lower their sales? The answer is no. But Patagonia is a much more interesting case. This is a privately held corporation founded by devoted environmentalists, and they actually get this idea of overconsumption. And this is a very famous ad that they had a few years ago. Front page, New York, or not front page, full page ad in the New York Times, all over other media. Don't buy this jacket. And they've created this Common Threads program, and they encourage you to be frugal and, you know, exercise those good Yankee values by keeping your products, fixing them and mending them, and then recycling or giving them away when you can't use them anymore, and lowering your consumption. So this is a great idea, but what happens if it works? Well, first of all, this ad caused sales to skyrocket. And there's a lot of tension in the company about that. Yvon Chouinard, the founder, was, first of all, the marketing people, when he said, we want to have this ad, they said, this is a horrible idea. But then after they did it over his objection, I mean, over their objections, sales went up, and they all said, fantastic. But
What did he say?
I don't know personally what he said, but my contact there, Tetsuya, who runs a lot of this work, won't really say. But let's say that everybody does this, right? So now what's the result? You've got a lot more disposable income because you're keeping your products. You're not buying a lot of new Patagonia or outdoor gear every year. You're keeping your products, you're mending them and fixing them. So what do you do with that extra money? Well, of course, you spend it. So, you know, you could take what you save buying at Patagonia and spend it on a trip to Patagonia, and your carbon footprint will go up. And that's the indirect rebound effect. And it can't be defeated until people say, no, I'm earning enough, I'm not going to work as hard, I'm not going to spend as much, I'm going to spend more time with family, with my community, I'm just disengaging from the growth engine and all those reinforcing vicious cycle feedbacks I showed you. So can government lead on this if corporations can't? And I think the answer is clearly no, because governments are committed to growth. The Fed, for example, has an explicit goal of sustainable economic growth, even though sustainable growth of anything that's real is impossible. So that's an oxymoron and can never be attained. You know, and our political leaders, just focusing on the United States, they think there's no limits to growth, and growth is the ultimate goal. And that's not just the Republicans. Just last Monday, Labor Day this year, earlier this week, President Obama said, I put my money on American workers and the belief that our economy grows best when everybody has a shot. So I love the equity story here, but the underlying ideology is growth is good, growth is the goal, and no government seeks to end that. So what do we need? We need a social movement. And how is that going to happen? Well, we don't really know. Social movement like this, like the civil rights movement. And you know, we really don't know how that's going to work. If it can happen, then eventually, with enough people standing up, and in this case, demanding an end to segregation and speaking out, racism is immoral, segregation is wrong, and taking action, that creates the political support that ultimately leads to political change, such as here you see President Johnson signing the Civil Rights Act in 1964. These kinds of social movements grow by reinforcing feedback. They grow through what we would now call viral processes. But there's a fundamental bias here, right? So which of these two things is going to grow virally faster? A cool new shoe or you should spend time with an elderly person in your community and really get to know them, right? You can't click and buy now for this. So there's a fundamental bias here. If I stay home, I meditate, I grow my own food, I don't work as hard, I don't consume as much, there's nothing for me to tweet about. I didn't buy this really cool new product. That's not going to work. So how do we get a social movement around sustainability and, carbon, but more deeply consumption and overconsumption to grow? So here are the core unanswered questions. There are a few of them, and there's more in the paper. So do we make an economic argument? Do we say sustainability is a lot cheaper than you think it is, and in fact, you can make a lot of money by investing in sustainability? And we know this is true. There are huge amounts of investments in energy efficiency and resource efficiency and waste reduction that companies are and can make that are positive net present value. And we've done it at MIT many times. So it's a win-win. Do we make that argument? Or is that argument going to fail because it doesn't appeal to any intrinsic core values? It's not a moral argument. It's not an argument that gets people in their deepest core values. In which case, maybe the right strategy is a Churchillian strategy that says there's going to be sacrifice here. It's going to be shared sacrifice. And maybe it's a little too extreme to say there's nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. But maybe that will motivate people more. I sacrifice for the good of the world, and I do that in a way that's shared sacrifice. So I'm not being exploited. I'm not being foolish. Can you mix these? We don't know. I'm suspicious. I don't think in the world of today, where everybody has access to every channel in the affluent world, that you can successfully segment and tell companies one thing and their employees one thing. Sustainability is profitable. And at the same time say it's also going to involve sacrifice. But I think that's an unanswered question. But just to wrap it up and not on a depressing note, we do know that these great miraculous transitions do happen. They do happen peacefully. They're rare, but they have happened. Anything that exists is possible. And we'll open it up for questions and comments. What I'm really looking for is, how do we do this? All the ways that we can actually get where we need to go on that. Okay, thanks. Let's